The simulation chamber was dark for exactly 3 heartbeats, and then the world exploded into existence around Myra, with a rush of heat and humidity that wrapped around her body like a wet blanket. She recognized the environment immediately, a tropical rainforest during monsoon season, with towering trees that blocked out most of the sky and vegetation so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing within a few meters. The air temperature registered somewhere around 34 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was so high that breathing felt like drinking, but Myra simply rolled her shoulders and started moving, because this was not a hostile environment to her. This was home. Outside the chamber, the observing cadets leaned forward in their seats, their various sensory organs focused on the display screens that showed Myra's progress through the simulated jungle. Kesrick sat with his arms crossed over his massive chest, waiting for the moment when the human would start to struggle, when her soft body would begin to fail in conditions that should have been comfortable for her own homeworld. He had bribed a technician to set the simulation to actual Earth conditions, expecting to expose the lie of human deathworld origins, expecting to watch Myra Chen stumble through an environment that was supposedly natural to her species. But something was wrong. The human was not stumbling at all. She moved through the dense undergrowth with an efficiency that made several cadets exchange confused glances, her feet finding solid ground even when the terrain looked treacherous, her hands pushing aside branches and vines without hesitation. The temperature readings on the display showed conditions that would have sent most species into heat shock within minutes, but Myra's biosigns remained steady, her heart rate actually decreasing as she settled into a rhythm of movement. "She seems comfortable," one of the Veleni cadets whispered, and Kesrick silenced them with a sharp hiss. Instructor Velketh stood near the primary control console, his scales pulsing with colors that indicated deep concentration, and he watched the human cadet with an expression that had shifted from curiosity to something closer to fascination. The simulation responded to Myra's calm progress by introducing obstacles, as it was designed to do, and the first challenge came in the form of insects, large flying creatures with stingers that delivered paralytic venom. Most cadets panicked when faced with swarms, but Myra simply covered her exposed skin with mud from the forest floor and kept walking, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid attracting more attention. "Why is she covering herself in dirt?" a Torvan cadet asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Camouflage," Velketh answered quietly, his ancient eyes never leaving the display, and scent masking. "She is hiding herself from predators by becoming part of the environment." The second obstacle appeared moments later, a large serpent coiled across her path, its scales marked with patterns that screamed danger to anyone with eyes evolved to recognize warning coloration. Myra stopped immediately, her body going still in a way that seemed almost unnatural, and she waited for nearly 2 full minutes without moving a single muscle. The snake eventually lost interest and slithered away into the undergrowth, and only then did Myra resume her careful progress through the jungle. Kesrick felt his confidence beginning to crack, but he refused to show it, because admitting concern would be admitting that he had underestimated the human, and Torvans never admitted such things. The simulation escalated again, this time introducing a flash flood that came roaring through a nearby ravine with almost no warning. Water surged through the jungle floor, rising quickly toward dangerous levels, and the observing cadets tensed in their seats, certain that this would finally be the challenge that broke the human. But Myra had already started climbing. She scaled the nearest tree with movements that spoke of practice and instinct, her hands and feet finding holds that seemed impossible, her body hauling itself upward with a strength that did not match her small frame. Within seconds she was above the floodline, wedged into a fork between thick branches, watching the water rush past below with an expression of absolute calm. How did she know? Someone asked, and no one had an answer. The truth was that Myra had felt the vibration through the ground before the water appeared, had heard the distant roar that her ears had learned to recognize during childhood camping trips, had read the signs that her planet had been teaching humans to read for 200,000 years. The flood passed, and Myra descended from her perch, landing softly on the muddy ground before continuing her journey through the simulation. Kesrix leaned toward the technician he had bribed, his voice a harsh whisper that carried more anger than he intended. "Increase the difficulty," he demanded. "Give her something that will actually challenge her." The technician hesitated, fear flickering across his face, because tampering with Academy simulations was a serious offense, and the Torvon's requests had already pushed him far beyond his comfort zone. But Kesrix was not the kind of creature who accepted hesitation, and his yellow eyes promised consequences for disobedience. So the technician's fingers moved across the control panel with trembling reluctance. The simulation registered the new parameters, and the jungle around Myra began to change. A predator alarm sounded, not for the cadets, but within the simulation itself, and the sounds of the forest went suddenly silent in that particular way that meant something dangerous was hunting. Myra froze, her head turning slowly as she scanned the shadows between the trees, and then she saw it. A tiger, or the simulation's recreation of one, emerged from the undergrowth barely 20 meters away, its massive body moving with fluid grace, its eyes fixed on her with unmistakable predatory intent. The observing cadets gasped and murmured with excitement, because surely this was the moment. Surely this was when the human would finally show fear, finally run, finally prove that her species was nothing more than clever prey animals who had somehow fooled their way into the stars. But Myra did not run. She made herself large instead, raising her arms above her head and spreading her jacket wide, and she began to shout, loud, harsh sounds that echoed through the simulated jungle with startling force. The tiger hesitated, confused by prey that refused to act like prey. Myra maintained eye contact and began backing away slowly, still shouting, still making herself appear as large and threatening as possible, and the tiger's confusion gradually transformed into disinterest. It was not worth the effort. The great cat turned and disappeared back into the shadows, and Myra allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to breathe before resuming her careful retreat from the area. In the observation tiers, absolute silence had fallen. Instructor Velkath's scales had stopped pulsing entirely, frozen in a pattern that indicated shock, and his ancient eyes stared at the display screens with something that looked very much like fear. Kesrix sat motionless, his 4 arms hanging limply at his sides, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt a cold sensation crawling up his spine that he did not recognize. The human had not defeated the predator through strength or speed or superior weaponry. She had defeated it through knowledge, through an understanding of how to manipulate a killer's instincts that could only have come from generations of coexistence with creatures that wanted her ancestors dead. And somewhere deep in his predator's brain, Kesrix began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The jungle vanished without warning, and Myra found herself standing in a world of white. Snow stretched in every direction as far as she could see, and the wind cut through her thin cadet uniform like 1,000 frozen knives, and the temperature had dropped so drastically that her first breath turned into visible mist that was torn away by the howling gale. For one terrible moment, her body seized up in shock, every muscle contracting against the sudden brutal cold, and she felt her heart stutter in her chest as her system tried to process the impossible transition. But then her training kicked in, not her academy training, but the older lessons, the ones that had been passed down through human generations, the survival knowledge that ran deeper than conscious thought. She had to move. Standing still meant death, and Myra knew this truth in her bones, So she forced her frozen limbs into motion and began assessing her situation with the rapid desperation of a creature that understood exactly how little time it had. In the observation area, chaos had erupted. Cadets were shouting questions and accusations, their voices overlapping in a dozen different languages that the translators struggled to process. And Instructor Velkith had rounded on the control console, with fury blazing across his bioluminescent scales. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Biome shifts are not part of standard solo exercises." The technician stammered something about system malfunctions, but his eyes kept darting toward Kesrik's, and Velkith was old enough to recognize guilt when he saw it. "You did this," the instructor said, turning to face the Torvan cadet with an expression that promised severe consequences. "You deliberately endangered a fellow cadet." Kesrix tried to maintain his composure, but his scales had paled to a sickly gray color that betrayed his growing fear, not of Velkith's anger, but of something else entirely. On the display screens, Myra was still moving. "That should have killed her," one of the Veleni cadets whispered, her voice trembling. "The thermal shock alone should have stopped her heart." But Myra's heart had not stopped, because human hearts had been dealing with impossible conditions since the first ice ages, and her body knew exactly what to do even when her conscious mind was still catching up. She was searching for shelter, her eyes scanning the frozen landscape with frantic purpose, and when she spotted a small depression in the snow near a cluster of ice-covered rocks, she made for it immediately. The wind screamed around her, tearing at her clothes and stealing what little warmth remained in her body. But she kept moving, kept pushing, kept refusing to surrender to the cold that wanted to claim her. She reached the depression and dropped to her knees, her hands already working despite the numbness that was spreading through her fingers, and she began to dig. "What is she doing?" someone asked. "Building a shelter," Velkith answered, and there was something new in his voice now, something that sounded almost like respect. "She is going to try to survive." Myra dug into the snow with movements that grew more desperate as her body temperature dropped, carving out a hollow space that would protect her from the wind, shaping the entrance at an angle that would prevent heat from escaping upward. She had learned this technique from books and videos, and one terrifying weekend camping trip with her father when she was 14, when a storm had caught them unprepared, and he had shown her how their ancestors had outlasted winters that would have killed any other species on Earth. The shelter took shape quickly, because Myra worked with the efficiency of someone who knew that every second mattered, and soon she was crawling inside, pulling loose snow behind her to seal the entrance and trap whatever body heat she still possessed. Inside the small dark space, she curled into a tight ball and began to shiver. "Her core temperature is dropping," the technician reported, his voice shaking. "She has maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia becomes irreversible." The observation area had gone completely silent, every cadet watching the displays with expressions that ranged from horror to disbelief to something that looked almost like hope. They wanted to see what would happen. They wanted to know if humans really were what the classification reports said they were. Myra's body shook violently inside the snow shelter, and she focused on controlling her breathing, on keeping the shivering going because shivering meant her body was still fighting, still generating heat, still refusing to give up. She thought about her mother's kitchen, about the warmth of summer days on Earth, about every comfortable moment she had ever experienced, and she held those memories close like burning coals in her chest. Time passed, minutes that felt like hours, and the observers watched as Myra's vital signs stabilized at levels that should not have been survivable. "Her heart rate is decreasing," the technician said, confusion evident in every word, "but her core temperature is holding steady." Velkith moved closer to the display, his ancient eyes reading the data with growing amazement. "She is rationing herself," he said quietly. Her body is redirecting blood flow to essential organs, slowing her metabolism, entering a controlled state of reduced function. She is not dying. She is adapting. The Torvan cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because this was not how prey animals behaved, and everything they had believed about humans was being challenged by the small figure curled up in a hole in the snow. Kesrick stared at the screen with an expression that had transformed from arrogance to something much closer to fear, because he was watching a creature survive conditions that would have killed a Torvan in minutes. And she was doing it through nothing more than knowledge and willpower. "She cannot last forever," one of his companions said, but the words sounded more like a question than a statement. As if in response to that doubt, the simulation shifted again. The snow shelter that Myra had built with such desperate care began to collapse around her, the weight of accumulated ice finally becoming too much for the simple structure to bear, and within seconds she was buried under a crushing weight of frozen white. The observing cadets gasped in unison, and several looked away, unable to watch what they assumed would be the end. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. The vital signs on the display flickered but did not flatline, and Velkith leaned forward with an intensity that made his scales pulse rapidly. "She is still alive," he breathed, and the words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the galaxy believed about the limits of survival. Then, with a burst of motion that made everyone jump, a fist punched through the surface of the snow. Myra Chen was not dead, and she was coming out. The snow exploded outward as Myra dragged herself from the frozen grave that should have been her end, and every cadet in the observation area watched in stunned silence as she emerged into the howling wind. Her skin had turned a color that most species associated with death, pale and bluish at the extremities, red and raw where frostbite had begun to set in, and blood ran from cuts where jagged ice had torn through her flesh during the collapse. She was shaking so violently that standing seemed impossible, yet somehow she rose to her feet anyway, her legs trembling beneath her, her arms wrapped around her body in a desperate attempt to conserve whatever warmth remained. And then she did something that made Instructor Velkith's scales go completely dark with shock. She looked directly at the observation window, at the spot where the cadets and the cameras were watching her, and her expression was not one of despair or defeat. It was defiance. Pure, unbroken, absolutely human defiance. "That is not possible," a Torvan cadet whispered, his voice cracking. "Her body should have shut down completely. How is she still conscious?" No one had an answer, because no one in that room had ever witnessed anything like what they were seeing now. Myra stood in conditions that would have killed most sentient species in minutes, her body failing around her in real time, and she refused to fall. The simulation continued its assault, the wind picking up speed until it nearly knocked her from her feet, but she leaned into it, planted her legs wide, and endured. "End it," someone called out from the observation tiers. "End the simulation before she dies." But Instructor Velkith did not move immediately, because something ancient in his predator's brain recognized what he was witnessing, and he could not look away. This was what humans were. This was why their death world had classified them as the apex species despite their lack of claws or fangs or armor. They simply refused to die. Myra took a step forward into the wind, then another, and another, her progress painfully slow but utterly relentless, and the observing cadets began to realize that she was not just surviving anymore. She was searching for something. "She is looking for better shelter," Velkith said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even now, even at the edge of death, she is trying to improve her situation." Kesrix felt something cold that had nothing to do with the simulated environment crawling through his chest, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to feel small. He had tried to humiliate this human, had tried to expose her species as weak and undeserving of their place among the stars. And instead, he had revealed something that made his own predator heritage seem almost insignificant. Myra found what she was looking for, a larger rock formation that offered partial protection from the wind, and she collapsed against it with her back to the stone, using her own body heat to melt a small hollow in the snow where she could curl up and wait. Her vital signs continued to decline, but the rate of decline slowed, and the technician at the control console realized with growing horror that she was going to survive. "How long can she last like this?" one of the Velani cadets asked, her voice trembling. "Hours," Velkith answered, and there was awe in his tone that he made no effort to hide. "Perhaps longer. Humans can enter states of reduced metabolism that allow them to survive conditions that would kill them under normal circumstances." He turned to face the assembled cadets, his scales pulsing with colors that indicated he was about to deliver an important lesson. "You have all been taught that Class 12 death worlds are rare," he said, "and that species originating from such worlds are typically characterized by extreme physical adaptations, armored bodies, toxic biochemistry, overwhelming strength." He gestured toward the display screens where Myra huddled against the frozen rock, her small body still shaking but still fighting. "Humans have none of those adaptations, and yet they conquered their death world completely, becoming the undisputed dominant species on a planet that kills with weather, with predators, with disease, with 1,000 different hazards that change from region to region and season to season." His eyes swept across the observation tiers, lingering on Kesrix for a long moment before continuing. "They did not conquer through strength or speed or natural weapons. They conquered through something far more dangerous." He paused, letting the silence stretch until every cadet was leaning forward in their seat. "Adaptation," he said finally, "and the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat is the only logical outcome." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and Kesrix felt the weight of them pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. He had spent his entire life believing that Torvans were the galaxy's ultimate predators, that their 4 arms and their powerful bodies and their hunting instincts made them superior to every other species. But the creature on those screens was showing him a different kind of predator, one that did not need claws or fangs, one that hunted through patience and endurance, and an iron will that simply would not break. Myra's shaking began to slow as her body conserved energy, and her eyes, still visible on the zoomed display, remained open and alert, watching the simulated environment for any opportunity to improve her chances. She was not waiting for rescue. She was not hopping for the simulation to end. She was calculating her next move, even now, even with frostbite spreading across her extremities and her core temperature dropping toward critical levels. "End it," Kesrix said suddenly, his voice rough. "End the simulation now." Velkith turned to look at him, with an expression that might have been surprise or satisfaction. "Why should I?" the instructor asked. "You wanted to see what humans are capable of. Are you not entertained?" Kesrix could not meet his gaze, and his scales had faded to a color that every Torvan recognized as submission. "I was wrong," he said, and the words seemed to cause him physical pain. "I was wrong about her, and I was wrong about her species, and if she dies because of my stupidity, I will never forgive myself." Velkith studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly and turned to the technician. "Terminate the simulation," he ordered, "and summon the medical team. Cadet Chen has earned the right to proper treatment." The frozen world around Myra flickered and disappeared, replaced by the familiar walls of the simulation chamber, and she collapsed immediately, her body finally surrendering to the damage it had sustained. But she was alive. Against all odds and all expectations, Myra Chen was still alive. The simulation chamber doors opened with a soft hiss, and medical personnel rushed inside with equipment designed to treat a dozen different species. But they stopped short when they saw Myra pushing herself up from the floor on trembling arms. "Cadet Chen, please remain still," the lead medic said, a Rithani whose scales pulsed with professional concern. "You have sustained significant cold damage and need immediate treatment." Myra looked up at him with eyes that still held the distant cold of the Arctic wasteland, and she shook her head slowly. "I can walk," she said, and her voice was rough and weak but absolutely certain. "I will walk out of here on my own feet." The medic started to protest, but something in her expression made him step back instead, and he watched in silence as Myra Chen rose from the floor and stood upright despite the damage that had been done to her body. The observation area had erupted into chaos the moment the simulation ended, with cadets shouting questions and demands and exclamations of disbelief. But now they fell silent as the human emerged from the chamber. She looked terrible, her skin still carrying that deathly pallor, her uniform torn and bloodstained, her movements stiff and painful. But she was walking, and that simple fact seemed to strike the assembled cadets harder than any demonstration of strength or speed could have. Instructor Velkith moved to intercept her, his ancient body positioning itself between Myra and the rest of the class. "Cadet Chen," he said quietly, "you should accept medical treatment. There is no shame in allowing others to help you recover from what you have endured." Myra met his gaze with an expression that softened slightly, because she recognized respect when she saw it, even from a species whose facial features were very different from her own. "I will," she said, "but first I need to say something if you will permit me." Velkith studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside with a gesture of acknowledgement. Myra turned to face the observation tiers, where hundreds of cadets from dozens of species watched her, with expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that looked almost like worship. She found Kesrix in the crowd without difficulty. His massive form and pale scales made him easy to spot, and she addressed her words directly to him, though her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You wanted to know what humans are," she said, and despite her weakness, there was no tremor in her voice. "You thought we were soft and weak and undeserving of our place among you. You thought that showing me my own homeworld would expose us as frauds." She paused to take a breath that rattled in her chest, but she did not look away from Kesrix's yellow eyes. "You were wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and not a single being in the observation area dared to contradict them. "Earth is a Class 12 death world because everything on it wants to kill everything else," Myra continued. "The weather kills, we have storms that flatten cities, cold that freezes the blood in your veins, heat that cooks the ground itself. The animals kill, the plants kill, even the water kills if you do not treat it properly." She spread her arms slightly, displaying her damaged body as evidence. "We did not evolve to be the strongest creatures on our planet, or the fastest, or the deadliest. We evolved to be the most stubborn, the most adaptable, the most absolutely unwilling to accept that anything can defeat us." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by something deeper than physical energy. "Our ancestors faced predators with nothing but rocks and sticks, and they won. They faced ice ages that lasted thousands of years, and they won. They faced plagues that killed half their population, and they won. They face everything their world could throw at them, and they are still here, still fighting, still refusing to stop." She pointed at Kesrix with a finger that trembled but did not waver. "You wanted to see what humans are capable of. Now you know. We are the species that does not give up, that does not surrender, that will crawl through fire and ice and death itself rather than accept that we cannot succeed." Silence filled the chamber, and Myra felt the last of her strength beginning to fade, but she had one more thing to say. "I do not hate you for what you did today," she said, and genuine honesty rang in every word. "I understand why you did it. You were afraid of something you did not understand, and fear makes us all do foolish things." She lowered her arm and let her shoulders relax. But now you understand, and I hope that understanding brings you wisdom instead of more fear. Because humans do not make good enemies, Kesrix, we make much better friends." The medics moved forward to catch her as her legs finally gave out, and they eased her onto a stretcher with gentle hands, while the observation area remained frozen in stunned silence. Instructor Velkuth looked around at his students, at the expressions of awe and fear and newfound respect that covered their faces, and he made a decision. "Class is dismissed early today," he announced. "What you have witnessed requires time to process, and I suggest you all use that time wisely." He paused, his ancient eyes finding Kesrix once more. "Some of you more than others." The cadets began to file out slowly, their conversations subdued and their movements uncertain, and Kesrix remained in his seat until the observation area was nearly empty. Then he rose and walked down toward the simulation chamber, where the medics were preparing to transport Myra to the medical bay. She saw him approaching and raised a hand to stop the medics from moving her stretcher. "Kesrix," she said, and there was no anger in her voice. The Torvund stood over her, his massive form casting a shadow across the stretcher. And for a long moment he said nothing. Then he dipped his head in a slow, deliberate gesture, the Torvund acknowledgement of an equal, of a warrior worthy of respect, of a predator that had proven itself through fire and blood. "I was wrong about your kind," he said, his voice rough with emotions that his species rarely expressed. "I see that now, and I will not forget what you have shown me today." Myra nodded in return, accepting the gesture for what it was. "Good," she said simply. "Then something useful came from all of this." The medics carried her away, and Kesrix stood alone in the empty chamber, his mind filled with new understanding of a species that had seemed so weak and was actually so strong. That evening, after Myra had been treated and was resting comfortably in the medical bay, a notification appeared in the Academy's central database. The entry for Earth had been updated, and though the classification remained Class 12, a new note had been added at the bottom of the file. It read simply, "Inhabitants fully adapted to all environmental extremes. Hostile engagement not advised under any circumstances." And in her hospital bed, with bandages on her hands and warmth finally returning to her bones, Myra Chen smiled.